Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. Now, around 80 million people in the world are displaced today. As these millions and millions of people flee conflict, persecution, and disaster, they do so during a raging pandemic. In light of the global conditions, we discuss how governments and local communities are responding to migrants and what kind of support is needed to help these lives cope during this distressing time. We take a look at these developments in greater depth. Joining us for this conversation, Mr. Asif Munier, who's a freelance development professional, a rights activist, and a cultural activist in Bangladesh. He also has over 12 years of experience working with various UN agencies on programs related to migration and refugees. He joins us from Dhaka. Also with us today is Dr. Maung Zarni, who is a scholar and activist on racism, fascism, and co-founder and head of 4C.co, a Southeast Asia-wide network of rights activists and scholars. He joins us from London. And Mr. Paul Nessa, who has worked with the Norwegian Refugee Council for more than 30 years. He joins us from Oslo. Thank you all for joining us and a very, very warm welcome to the show. Dr. Maung Zarni, I'd like to begin with you and want to begin by looking at a picture together. Now, when we look at this picture, it has been making a lot of rounds on social media lately, and these are migrants at sea. And clearly, you can see the distress here. Let's try to dig a little deeper into the narrative that is surrounding migrants these days, especially. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thought is that this is almost a universal phenomena. Often or typically, the outcome of raging internal conflicts, civil wars, and in some cases, such as my own country of birth, Myanmar or Burma, an ongoing genocide. And the migrant crisis gets a major attention when migrants and asylum seekers, essentially they're not migrants, they're refugees. They're fleeing conflicts and deplorable conditions on land in their own home countries for safer places anywhere. And so this is like the picture we're looking at is essentially the asylum seekers and refugees attempting to cross and reach safe shores in the Mediterranean on the European side. But what is missing is that, these crises are often, the trigger by the resource extraction or geopolitical rivalries, by the Western European and major powers in the brown and black continents such as Asia or Europe. Africa, and in some cases Latin America, in the case of the United States and the refugees and asylum seekers flooding along Mexico, California and Texas, Arizona borders.
Right. Sure, Paul Nessa. Now, Dr. Zarni made a very important distinction here, which was that these aren't migrants, these are refugees. And I think that's more important to talk about because the narrative and often the retorts that are given when these refugees reach shores or when they travel to other foreign lands is that they shouldn't enter borders without due process and what they're doing is illegal. But trying to understand how important that distinction is, that it's not driven by a choice, but by conditions that are taking them to those places. How important is it to understand that context?
It is very important because it remains a universal human right, the right to seek asylum. And therefore, we cannot judge before people have had that possibility to present their case and then determine whether they have a need for protection. So in some areas, like if we see pictures of Rohingyas fleeing Myanmar, most of them would certainly fall into the refugee category. In Europe, it varies, but two imperatives. One is, as said, you have the right to seek protection. You don't, and second, is the whole idea that you rescue people at sea, no matter what their background and reason for trying to cross is.
And you say that while a very damning report comes out by the New York Times, which states that Greece was responsible for expelling almost 1,000 refugees back into sea during this time. And this has been happening since March through various intervals. When you heard of this, what was the first thing that crossed your mind?
I think there are two things that come at the same time. One is that this is unacceptable. It's a clear violation of international law. The second is, though, some understanding of the dilemma Greece has ended up in. A country like my own, Norway, only got some 2,000 asylum seekers last year, whereas Greece got 75,000. And Greece used to be a transit country where people would come from the Middle East, particularly from Turkey, through Greece and travel up through Europe to other countries, including my own. Now all the borders out of Greece have been closed. So they all end up in Greece. And so Greece, because of its location, does not receive the support and responsibility sharing of other European countries that really should have been a must. And it's embarrassing to come from a continent that cannot handle 20,000 refugees stranded on the Greek island of Lesbos.
Right. Mr. Asif Munier, you talked from Dhaka. You talked to us from a place which has hosted a huge number of refugees. Now, when you hear Mr. Paul Nessa talk about these dilemmas of more stabilized or better developed European states, what are the thoughts that cross your mind? Do you see the value and the weight in those arguments?
Thank you. Definitely, yes. And there's no comparison. If you think about, the refugee population in different countries, including Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of people. And these are, again, developing countries who struggle with their own communities of poverty and other challenges, disasters as well. So there is a global disparity. I mean, if you talk about, in terms of rights, we don't live in an ideal world where rights are ensured for all. I mean, we do have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, other different international instruments, but even today, not all countries, if we're talking about refugees, not all countries have actually signed the Refugee Convention. Or the Migrants' Rights Convention. Many from South Asia, if you're talking about migrants, migrant workers, migrant labor who work as manual laborers in the Gulf countries, and many of these Gulf countries have not signed the Migrants' Rights Convention. So when you talk about rights, they are not under any international obligation to actually confirm that they are providing or ensuring the rights. So it is a challenging world, and definitely there is disparity in terms of rights. Which country is talking about rights, it's a matter of perspective as well.
Right, Mr. Asif Munier, you say this, that many countries are not signatories to the Refugee Convention, and therefore they're not obligated under international law. At this stage, during the conditions we are in and what we're seeing, does it even matter if you are a signatory or not to this convention? Because it seems like we are seeing a grave human rights violation by countries that are also part of this convention.
Although it may not be very clearly defined, but in terms of emergency situations or unusual circumstances, it does fall within these international law as well. And at the same time, because of the COVID-19, and the way it's been spreading, but also how countries are struggling to manage that, they are having to deal with not their own population and other population who are either maybe temporary migrant workers or immigrant communities. The challenges of working alongside these migration issues was already there. With the pandemic, it has kind of expanded manifold, much more complicated now.
Right. And I'm going to talk more about that with Mr. Paul Nessa as well. But before that, I want to talk to Dr. Maung Zarni and talk to him about this pandemic and what fears do you think are there in scholars such as, in the minds of scholars such as yourself who work on racism and the type of narrative change there will come after this pandemic and once things are settled down? Do you think there will be a shift in how host countries view migrants?
No, I think I want to, touch on one issue that came up, which is the international obligations of states and what they are expected to do, either morally or legally, in the face of, the large numbers of humans knocking on their door for refuge and safety. I think, the problem is that states are allowed by civil society and other outlets, including the media, to hide behind this, the absence of legal obligations to take in. But in some cases, like, you've got the law of the Sea Convention, which obligate different countries to rescue the boats in distress in their national waters or even international waters. So one is legal obligation, like agencies that are mandated, such as the UNHCR, to provide protection. Let me repeat, to protect the refugees. Those agencies compromise because that they operate in countries that do not have obligations under UN refugee conventions to allow or cooperate with the UN agencies. And so I think the other one is the narrative, the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we have this war on terror,
Dr. Zarni, before we talk about the pandemic, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned here, which is the obligation and parts of it, the various conventions that obligate states to act in a certain way. It's also about accountability. If they do not act in a certain way, who are they accountable to?
The problem is that there are no enforcement mechanism globally. So we've got this, one of the most enlightened political organizations on earth, European Union, with major human rights documents enshrined as part of the foundations, right? 26 country member. And European Union is funding former genocide perpetrators on the African continent to serve as Europe's border force. In other words, the European Union is financing former perpetrators of the Sudanese genocide to keep the Africans from fleeing across Mediterranean to reach safety in Europe. So when you have model organizations such as European Union setting extremely bad example for the rest of the world, and then the United States, the same thing. That today the UN was.
Right, Dr. Zarni, I get your point there, and that's something I want to take to Mr. Paul Nessa as well and discuss this with him. Mr. Paul Nessa, when we talk about the migration crisis, how much displacement there is in the world today, it's important to talk about how something happening in one part of the world does create ripples all across the world. In what Dr. Maung Zarni talked about and the example he stated, how much role do organizations like the one that you've worked with other civil society actors have in trying to influence government policies to not create messes or embolden perpetrators of violence in other places?
I think we have two roles. One is because we are a witness to much is happening, to tell the public and to tell politicians what we see, observe, and learn. And so to be a voice for the displaced people themselves, who often lack that possibility. And the other one is to try to engage the public. There is a very double thing. On the one hand, very many are a bit scared of migrants and refugees, think it's a bit much. And there's a very common narrative now that, we're drowning in refugees and migrants, which isn't true. On the other hand, there is also quite a lot of support for the basic idea that people who need protection should get it. So we need to speak to these voices. We need to bring the issues up, and not least to try to come forward with some of the examples we have where there's actually been a constructive engagement to solve such an issue. I was myself involved with the Vietnamese boat people in the late 80s, early 90s, where they actually found a solution that included legal migration, that included protection for some, that included return and cooperation with the host country. It took a lot of international effort, it took a lot of negotiations, and it took more than anything political will. And this is the kind of political will we're presently missing, particularly in Europe, to find solutions for. It's also a lack of political will we now see in Southeast Asia in relation to the Rohingyas, for instance, in a country like Malaysia.
Right. Meshal, now, when you're talking about how important those voices are in this conversation, voices of NGOs, voices of those who witness the human cost of this, it seems like that space is also shrinking. We're hearing more and more reports about how NGOs are under attack and they are being restricted from carrying out their duties and work. Is that something you feel like is a rising trend as well?
Well, we are under attack in a couple of ways. One is that it's actually much more unsafe to be a humanitarian worker. More humanitarian workers are being killed every year now than ever before. We're also given less space. That is very true. They're trying to restrict our movement. One example, again, back to the Mediterranean Sea, where NGO rescue ships are doing what the Coast Guards used to do to rescue people at sea, are ending up in trouble. So there is a political shrinking of space. But again, I think this space is not given, and it's up to us and people who are concerned, and a fair few politicians, fortunately, are too, to try to reopen some of the basic humanitarian values.
Right. Mr. Asif Munier, does this resonate with as well when we're talking about shrinking spaces for activists and humanitarian workers? Does this resonate for you and for what you're seeing happening in this part of the world?
Definitely it does. And I can say, for instance, in South Asia, including where I'm based in Dhaka in Bangladesh, I think all over South Asia, especially during the current pandemic, in the name of spreading rumor or misinformation, certain issues of governance or lack of good governance, which has been sort of expanded manifold during the pandemic, if there are any kind of voice of resentment or criticism, that's being silenced. It goes for NGOs, it goes for civil society activists, journalists, and as well as rights activists. So, in terms of political space, in terms of the freedom of expression, that's being sort of curtailed a lot in the name of national security or in the name of spreading rumor.
Right. Dr. Maung, now I'm going to come back to that point that I didn't let you finish off before, but I think it fits in very well into the conversation we're having right now. When spaces when spaces are created by the vacuum that's left behind when civil society actors, when humanitarian workers are silenced, that vacuum can be filled up with a more damaging rhetoric. So when we're talking about what is happening right now, what are your fears about how the story, the human cost, the way it's presented, how all of this will shift and change after we're done with this pandemic?
Well, I think two things that are being pursued, both by national security states, so-called, and right-wing political organizations that scapegoat refugees and asylum seekers, and even legitimate, migrants for the ills of their domestic problems. Say, for instance, it's not just in Europe. I mean, right next to Pakistan, in India, the BJP Hindu fundamentalist government have scapegoated Muslims, 300 plus Muslims of India, as basically a threat to Hindu civilization. And they've been demonized, and they've been basically there's an attempt to strip off millions of the Assamese Muslims of Indian citizenship. And within Europe, I mean, where I live in the UK, the securitization of this issue. I mean, basically, refugees coming to the shores of the England and British Isles is insignificant compared to, what Turkey or like Bangladesh are forced to host, millions. And yet we have a right-wing, I would say, like neo-fascist English and other the organizations and politicians use this issue to whip up, populist, mainstream, majoritarian racism against people who are different from them culturally in the physical features. And so this is a real danger, and this is emerging around the world, like USA here, Hungary at the heart of Europe is another one, and Italy, France. And so all these developments do not augur well. And humanitarian crises, the trigger often by geopolitical rivalries of European powers and extractive industries based in the rich Western European countries,
right?
They get away with murder. They have helped trigger these migrant and refugee crises because of the wars and extraction they're involved in.
Right. Dr. Zarni, you raise a number of very, very important points here, some that, of course, require a person to look much, much deeper into what's happening. But unfortunately, we're short on time to do that. But I do want to ask Mr. Paul Nessa and Mr. Asif Munier one last question. Mr. Paul Nessa, if you had to very quickly talk about what work, given these very difficult circumstances, given the pandemic, given the lack of resources, the very bare minimum that needs to be done by communities, by governments in order to help the refugee populations, what would that be?
A couple of things. One is to make sure that you don't exclude refugees or other foreigners or people who are displaced within countries from health programs and any government initiatives to prevent spreading of COVID-19 and to include people in health programs. The other one is to remember that very many displaced persons now are much more worried about getting food than getting infected.
Right.
Because many are in the margins of the economy. The economy is slowing down, so very many end up without work, without money, and without food. And that's the biggest concern. And so and whether it's a host country or to the richer countries of the world, be much more generous to secure that people simply don't starve to death and that they don't lose all hope of moving on tomorrow.
Right. Mr. Asif Munier, I was the exact same question to you, but such an interesting point, an important one. Almost 80% of the refugee populations that are housed in countries, they are facing food security issues here. So we're going to clump that also into the question and talk about, given this context as well and the COVID-19 pandemic, what is the bare minimum that NGOs, that civil society and the government especially needs to do for its refugee population?
I would say three things in addition to what other colleagues have said. One is about social protection, which could include the issue of food or basic supplies as well. So strengthening existing social protection mechanisms within a country. That should also include migrants and refugees. The other is that, of course, we would be facing, some say that, in terms of economic crisis, the first time ever such a crisis since the World War II. So in terms of any kind of economic reform plans that any country, all countries are thinking of, that should again include provisions for migrants and refugees, not just for citizens of that particular country. And the third, I would say that where the NGO, civil society and other actors, including the government, can play a role, is that public empathy. I mean, we did bring out the issue of xenophobia and stigmatization and the fact that a lot of blame are being labeled on migrants and refugees, that they are the problem, especially in a pandemic. So some kind of empathy, and where there could be public service campaigns, more, in terms of creating an awareness that they are not a problem, they're part of the solution, or the problem was already there, but you cannot exclude that problem and kind of address other issues in the country. So that's kind of what I have for the moment.
Right, and those are all very insightful comments there. Thank you so much, Mr. Asif Munier, Dr. Maung Zarni, Mr. Paul Nissa, all for joining us and talking to us about this, shedding more light into what's happening regarding displaced communities, what's happening for refugees and what's happening against them during this time. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at the latest climate news. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Earth's warming. Every year we hear about stories that point out about how much more the Earth is heating. But this year, with the COVID-19 crisis, many climate stories have been sidelined. On today's show, we highlight important climate stories related to the Earth becoming warmer and understand what that truly means. We also will have a larger conversation about how activists and policymakers can plan and mobilize during this pandemic. Joining us for this conversation is Sandrine Dixson, who has 30-plus years of experience with Europe in terms of international policy, business leadership, and strategy experience with particular focus on EU and international climate change sustainable development. She joins us from Brussels. Also joining us is Mr. Sven Hermling, who's the global policy lead on climate change and resilience at CARE International. He joins us from Bonn, and Ms. Clare Nullis, who's the media officer at World Meteorological Organization. She joins us from Geneva. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to this show. Clare, I'd like to begin with you, and let's look at a tweet that was put out by WMO. So this is a piece of information that has been making a lot of news, that is being shown all across social media because it seems to be very, very important news. Just tell us why this is so alarming.
Yes, the resort, so the national park, Death Valley National Park, reported a temperature of 55.4 degrees Celsius on Sunday. This really is incredible heat. It's certainly the hottest temperature in the world since 1931. What's significant about it is that we are seeing, nearly as high temperatures on an increasingly regular basis. Countries such as Pakistan, countries such as Kuwait, and then obviously now at the moment in the United States. Death Valley, it's known to be the hottest place on Earth. People go there as tourists. They take photos of themselves in these high temperatures. And they take precautions. But what is the bigger threat and the bigger impact on human health and human safety is when you get these equally high temperatures, 50 degrees Celsius above, occurring in densely populated urban areas. And that is what we are increasingly seeing, unfortunately.
Right. Clare, I'm going to come to you and talk to you more about the trajectory of things and how you mentioned that we're hearing about these reports more and more, how records are breaking more and more. But I want to talk to Sandrine and Sven about something that I mentioned earlier, which was about a lot of climate change-related news being sidelined during this time, of course, because of the pandemic. Sven, I'd like to begin with you. Now, what is one piece of information or one piece of news that you felt was very alarming but wasn't highlighted enough because of this crisis?
Like the temperature example you gave from Death Valley, but more or less every day I receive an information from colleagues across CARE from other countries, floods in Ethiopia, floodings in Bangladesh, they have been relatively in the news, floodings in Niger. And basically on top of these heat situations, we have extreme flooding events, and often we know they are exacerbated by climate change, and it makes it really difficult for people. I mean, it's often causing a lot of harm, of course, displacement, but in situations where people at the same time try to be careful in many countries not to be infected by COVID, but at the same time it limits their possibilities, for example, to enter protection shelters, etc. So I think this is something which is not enough on the radar, the compound risks of COVID-19 and the climate change impact we're basically seeing today.
Right. Sandrine, one news piece that you felt wasn't highlighted enough, but really does show how alarming the climate crisis is, one thing that came out this year.
The incredible heat wave that we've seen in those areas. I mean, when you speak about Death Valley, you clearly think that we're going to have high temperatures. When you look at the Antarctica or the Arctic and also the Siberian permafrost, you do not think of having 30-degree temperatures. This is what is actually hitting the planet now. And I think that if we don't make the links between the convergence of tipping points between this pandemic and climate change and biodiversity loss, then we have totally lost sight of what is happening today to each citizen across the globe. So it's very important to show citizens that what's happening in terms of COVID and this zoonotic disease, which is exacerbated by humanity's impact on biodiversity and climate, is actually part of a series of tipping points that will only get worse if we don't look at these tipping points together.
Right. When we're talking about all of this and all these news stories, the point that I want to now talk about is how difficult has it become to communicate all this information? There's so much that's happening in the world that's related to the climate crisis, so many news stories, and it often becomes overwhelming for an average reader to absorb them. How can we make sense of all of this, and what is the difficulty in communicating it all?
I think the bottom line, and it's something that the World Meteorological Organization is repeating time and time again, the UN Secretary General, other UN leaders are repeating time and time again, is a virus, COVID, is not a substitute for climate action. And we should use, the economic slowdown, the resulting reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We really need to use this COVID crisis as a platform to grow back greener and to grow back better. It's an opportunity we cannot afford to miss. And as one of the previous speakers said, we really live in an interconnected world. So what we've seen happening in the Arctic this year is a temperature of 38 degrees Celsius in Siberia, which is unheard of. It's off the scales. What is happening in the Arctic? It does not stay in the Arctic. It is affecting people everywhere in the globe. It will be affecting people in Pakistan, India, in the tropics, in the southern hemisphere. We live in a global world, an interconnected world, and we're in this together, and we need to take climate action together.
Such an important point, the last one you make, and I want to definitely talk about that more. But before that, I'm going to take this earlier point you made about this continuously being reiterated that the pandemic is not a substitute for climate action. And I'm going to take this to Sandrine. Sandrine, you work a lot with policy. So when Clare says this, how do you understand it, and what do you see happening that could lead people to think that it is a substitute for climate action?
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous point, and it's absolutely correct. What we need to do is think that we are in a planetary emergency. I mean, what the Club of Rome has done through its planetary emergency declaration and plan and its discussions with policymakers is say we need to do what any state, any region, or any company would do when faced with emergency. Whether we decide that COVID plus climate plus biodiversity constitutes the emergency, which is what we're saying. But then we need to say, okay, well, how do you emerge from emergency? You need to, exactly as was indicated, build back better. But building back better doesn't enable you to build back a glacier that's already melted. Building back better doesn't enable you to actually put back the permafrost that is completely gone. We need to be very careful when we talk about building back better, that this actually means we cannot go back to business as usual. Because of this state of emergency, we need to rethink and redesign as we're facing disaster. And that redesign means that we need to have new economic systems that are moving much more towards well-being economics, that we look at valuing nature and people's lives and access to water, access to bare essentials in our financial system and then our economic system. And I'll close with the fact that we already have examples of companies who are actually coming back more resilient because they already took into consideration stranded assets and de-risked by looking at sustainability in their bottom line. We have examples of economies that have done the same through what we call the well-being economies: Iceland, Scotland, Finland, Wales, and also cities who have started to integrate more resilient economic indicators to enable well-being for its people.
Right, those are all very important points you make there. Sven, when we're talking about the Earth becoming warmer, so many examples have been laid out how that's going to create an impact, how that's very alarming. But when we talk about how one place seeing a record high temperature, in fact, also impacts an area that's much far off, what do we mean by that? What is the human cost of all of what is happening?
Well, I think people more and more understand, and also people on the streets, so to say, understand that the human cost is immense. And one of the previous speakers referred to the immense impacts of heat waves in cities we are already seeing, whether it's in India, Bangladesh, or European cities. And I think people more and more understand that this is a new normal in a way, but it's not the normal we want to accept. And that this requires absolute action at all levels. And my sense is also with the impact of the pandemic, there are more people who are now, let's say, open to also supporting more radical measures, so to say, to confront the climate crisis. Building a better future means both, of course, becoming more resilient to the climate change impacts we still have in front of us. And we know we're just at the beginning to some extent. But at the same time, of course, limit climate change as much as possible. And that's why the green recovery discussion is quite important. Unfortunately, if you look at some of the analyses that most G20 countries, the recovery packages they put on the table, they're still putting much more money into brown, into bad solutions than into green solutions like renewable energies. Although there's enough analysis that shows that the green solutions will be much more effective. They can provide a lot of health benefits. It can also help to tackle some of the inequalities that climate change is exacerbating around gender inequality, racial inequalities. So I think what is also important to at the moment is to basically beat the drum in terms of the solutions that are not only required, but that are already implemented by various cities, stakeholders, and to basically multiply those. And I think that's also a certain, let's say, level of confidence that people need, that they're not only hearing about the bad things happening. Of course, I totally agree, we need to inform about that. But we need to connect it to basically showing that change is possible and change is demanded in many places around this planet by local movements, by cities, and so on.
Right, Sven, I'm going to pick up that very last point and very quickly tell us, how can civil society, how can activists mobilize during this pandemic? What are some of the options that you are aware of, and some things that people can do in order to keep up this momentum, keep up with this conversation?
It is, of course, reflecting on the value of high quality community organizations, so to say. And this doesn't mean only like a state-run community organization, but also people organizing themselves. And we've seen in the demonstrations, the marches we've seen over the last years demanding climate action, that this also brought together a lot of people who are taking the next steps. I see it in my community and others. There are so many initiatives where people want to work together for change. That's one thing. I think that it's, of course, important to do media and information work in terms of informing about the problems as well as the challenges and solutions that are out there. But of course, it's also very important to do direct advocacy towards governments as well as parliamentarians who often decide where the money goes. I think that's very critical at the moment.
Right, Clare, your organization, and I'm going to end with this question, your organization is, of course, important because it creates this framework for how international cooperation can happen and how they need to work on certain solutions during this time, during when, like I said, so much of this news is being sidelined. How much more difficult has that task become, and how are you and various important organizations working to circumvent some of those issues?
The annual climate change negotiations, which were scheduled to take place in late at the end of this year in Glasgow, have been postponed until next year because of COVID and the emergency. But I think the message of the World Meteorological Organizations and the UN as a whole is that climate action shouldn't wait until people sit down in a negotiating room. We need to act with urgency. We need to start acting now. Governments really should be putting in place their plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to meet the Paris Agreement targets, so that we can keep temperature increase within a manageable level. At the moment, we are missing the Paris Agreement targets by quite a considerable amount. Greenhouse gas concentrations are rising this year. They will continue to rise next year. And I think the message that we really need to get home is that the laws of physics mean that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for many generations. It's not something that we can remove with a magic wand. There is no quick fix. There is no magic wand. So the problems that we are creating today will be with our children, with our grandchildren, with their children. And so I think, it's not a case of thinking about, formal discussions and multilateral agreements only. It really is, we need to think of the future. We need to think of future generations and the future planet.
Right, that's a very important point, and I'm going to end it on this, that the damage we're causing to the environment is irreversible in many, many ways. It's going to pass down to generations from generations. So it's important to understand what's happening today isn't just damage control. It's about having an option for a future. Thank you so much, Clare, for joining us, Mr. Sven Hermling for joining us, Sandrine for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.